And now I would like to invite General Sir Chris Deverell, venture partner and former 4-star general in the British Army in the United Kingdom. Sir Deverell will speak with us about new defense. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to talk about new defense, as you've just heard. What does it need to be, and how do we get there? But the first thing I think I'd like to say is I actually think that everybody who's been speaking to you this morning from this stage has been talking about new defense. I've been really struck by the consistency of message. I was a soldier for 40 years, nearly, and I have been retired for 5. In the second half of my career, roughly 50% of it, I've focused on the hand-to-hand combat that is defense capability development and acquisition. I've been a user, a requirement setter, a budgeteer, a fleet manager, a buyer, and latterly a supplier, or rather, I advise suppliers. And when I think back to the start of my career as a requirement setter, what I can observe with the benefit of hindsight is a tremendous tendency to seek the exquisite. There was a kind of internal logic to that. We could see that the replacement cycle for our major platforms was very long. We might, if we were getting a new tank, we might expect it to be in service for 30, 40, 50 years. So we wanted to future-proof it as far as possible. And that drove us to cutting-edge technologies that would survive into the future, wouldn't be obsolete as the tank entered service. And that creates a spiral. As you get more exquisite, the platforms get more expensive, so you buy fewer and fewer of them, and so they have to be better and better, and so on. So it's reinforcing that tendency. But the consequence of it is risk, expense, and delay. And I think perhaps even more significantly, what we just didn't envisage was needing to replace our platforms during conflict. We kind of had a 30-day view of war. I think we had forgotten what all of our predecessors would have known from the Second World War, which is that, of course, you must be able to mass-produce capability quickly in times of conflict. And we just ignored that or forgot about it, or it was too difficult, so we left it alone. But if you leap forward to today, you're obviously seeing conflict in the Ukraine, which is consuming vast amounts of equipment and ammunition, and in which we have rediscovered the benefits of mass, even perhaps or especially attritable mass, or rather the disbenefits of relying solely on exquisite capabilities. Now, I have to say that I think our previous assumptions in this area were reinforced by our partners in the defense industry, for whom this tendency towards the exquisite was a very handy barrier to entry against new entrants to the market, given that they were generally funded by cost-plus programs and so didn't tend to suffer from the competitiveness penalty associated normally with a high cost base. So as a consequence, what our defense manufacturers build can no longer easily be made by other manufacturers outside the defense sector, as was so successfully done during the Second World War, as you've heard earlier, when, for example, car manufacturers switched to making airplanes and tanks. But we simply cannot afford to live in a world any longer in which it takes 3 years to replenish a stock of anti-tank missiles, which was pretty minimal in the first place, or in a world in which we can make less ammunition in a month than we would need in a day of conflict. Not only can we not win a war this way, we won't deter war this way. So for me, the first part of new defense is developing the ability to manufacture on a much greater scale, if need be, and faster. This won't happen by accident, quite the reverse, in fact. Our experience of the last 5 decades is that this is precisely what will not happen unless we plan for and, to some degree, importantly, contract for resilience. We need to think about what factories we must have and how we increase our rate of production in times of crisis. And we must strike international agreements and arrangements that avoid every ally having to have the capacity to do everything. Now, if we are smart about how we think about technology, this doesn't have to mean keeping hugely expensive production lines open. If we take a software-first approach, we can profoundly change manufacturing, as we've heard already today, and as companies like Tesla, SpaceX, and many others are already demonstrating. If we design systems that are simple, modular, and producible, as far as possible with commercially available components and materials, resilience will be a powerful byproduct. People tend to think of software and hardware as 2 different things, and I think they are certainly not so now, if indeed they ever were. A software-first approach to capability will allow a leap in performance both at the level of the individual piece of equipment, but also at the level of our whole system. The advent of digital, and therefore of data on an unimaginable scale, of automation, of robotics, of ubiquitous connectivity and computation, of GPUs and of artificial intelligence, is what has made this possible now, and new defense must take advantage of it. If we do, we can break free of the tyranny of highly specialized labor for manufacturing, which our companies struggle to generate. And we can also free ourselves of the tyranny of time. We don't have to move from design to development to demonstration to production to in-service. We can go from prototype into scale production with an MVP and then develop it iteratively with feedback from users. Software-defined means you can change things and worry much less about the unintended consequences, both in the thing that you're making and in how you are making it. To do this, we need to take advantage of the place where the economic incentives for talent are strongest, which today is largely the world of startups. The startup world, in the main, secures capital from venture capital. VCs make a bet on the future revenues of a startup and then feed them enough capital to test that bet. They take a portfolio approach to risk, which tolerates failure in some of the bets on the assumption that some will pay off handsomely, as has indeed been the case for many successful VCs. In turn, the startups take that capital and use it, amongst other things, to buy talent, with the added benefit of being able to share or to offer a share of their new business to attract that talent. In my experience, this means that the talent that they acquire is many leagues more capable than that available, for example, in the Ministry of Defense. So this world of venture capital and startups has to be another part of new defense. In most of the West, the dominant model in defense procurement is one based on prime contractors, who, over the decades, have become a mirror image of the ministries of defense they support. This model is naturally slow-moving and risk-averse, for the good reason that haste and inadequate management of risk have in the past contributed to failures in defense procurement. But it historically follows a linear, sequential, or waterfall approach to project management in an attempt to reduce risk. You've heard today, I think, some examples of prime contractors trying to behave differently, and I strongly encourage that and believe it is possible. But I think it's still the case that there is a tendency to demand requirements set ab initio when the user is often not best placed to express their true needs. And as a rule, this approach also produces capability later and more expensively than the user initially sought. Delay in turn causes cost growth, leading to higher unit prices and thence to smaller fleet sizes. And it also exposes programs to changes in circumstances. Take the UK, for example. In the last 15 years, there have been 5 defense reviews, all of which could potentially have completely changed the program, even if in practice they didn't. And even if contracts can be struck that make suppliers bear the risk or the cost of delay, which is often not the case, operational risk is carried by the user for so long as the delay exists. And the other significantly adverse effect of this model is that development is paid for by the customer. Industry tends to invest relatively little of its own capital, and the customer bears the risk if development fails. So I think that model is ripe for disruption, in the same way that disruption has occurred in lots of other sectors as a result of the digital revolution. And there's no fundamental reason why the benefits of the venture capital and startup model cannot accrue in defense as in other sectors. Historically, defense has been perceived as not a big enough market to attract large amounts of venture capital in its own right, and the sales cycles have been seen as long and Byzantine. Worse, I think, the threats faced by Western societies, with the great exception, I would say, of Israel, hasn't been sufficiently disquieting to overcome constraints in things like ESG investment policies. These have further inhibited investment in defense. But I think recent events in Europe, most notably, but not only, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have changed market sentiment significantly. And money is certainly flowing. In 2024, NATO spending, for example, is increasing by 11% in real terms, and amongst the European members of NATO, it's increasing by 19%. And I think that trend is only going to continue, not least in light of pressure from the Trump administration. And the ESG climate is definitely changing as societies recognize that their ability to pursue other values depends on their ongoing freedom. All this is positively impacting, the good news, on the share prices of the large existing defense businesses, but it's also encouraging more investment in defense from new sources. For example, the NATO Innovation Fund and the European Investment Fund have created large pools of capital to invest in defense tech. And private capital is increasingly flowing into this area as well, as we've seen from large funding rounds for the likes of Palantir, Anduril, Helsing, and other new defense companies. So, I think the future is to some degree already with us. Particularly, I think that could be said of Israel or parts of the Israeli defense ecosystem. But it's maldistributed. There are certainly parts of the defense landscape across the Western world which are not really new defense. They're still old defense. New defense needs to be resilient, software-defined, and it needs to access new sources of capital. There is a huge opportunity for new defense in the kinds of things we buy, the way in which things are made, how they come to market, who finances them, and how they are developed over time. It's not just a theoretical opportunity. As I say, it's happening. It's not going to be easy. Change never is. But more to the point, I think if we don't collectively adopt new defense, we will be in deep trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you.